Husband. That single word, delivered through Tom Ashby's door at first light by 8 Chiricahua warriors, would cost him everything he thought he understood about his own life, and give him something far better in its place. He had barely laced his boots when he heard them in the yard. He cracked the door, and there they were, horses steaming in the cold September air, the nearest man pointing first at Tom and then at the woman resting on Tom's bed, saying that word again. And the woman Tom had found at the spring 3 days ago, burning with fever near death, looked through the doorway at her people and did not correct him. That is where this story ends up. But to understand how a young homesteader in New Mexico territory, with a failing claim and no particular plans for marriage, found himself regarded as a husband by a people he had only begun to know, you have to go back to the spring on the eastern edge of the Mimbres foothills, to a Tuesday morning in September of 1885, and to the moment Tom Ashby made the simple, unremarkable, life-altering decision to pick up a sick woman and carry her home. Her name was Test. His was Tom Ashby, and neither one of them saw what was coming. Watch this story all the way through, and if these stories have found their way to you, please like and subscribe. The people who keep them going are the ones who choose to stay. Tom Ashby had come west in the spring of 1884 with $82, a bay horse named Deuce, a second-hand plow, and the particular confidence of a man who had not yet failed at anything that truly mattered. The West corrected that quickly. The 160 acres he had homesteaded on the edge of the Mimbres foothills turned out to be grudging land, dry, stony, more inclination toward scrub juniper than toward corn. The claim was 6 miles from the nearest cluster of buildings that called itself a town, which gave it a romantic isolation in theory and an exhausting isolation in practice. By late summer of 1885, he had one standing building, a root cellar, a spring that ran reliable if never generous, and approximately no money. The corn had come in thin 2 years running. The well needed deepening. The south fence needed new posts. The list of things that needed doing expanded faster than Tom could work through it, and he worked from before sunup to well past dark 7 days out of 7. He was not an unhappy man. He was clear on the difference, even if the people back in Columbus might have had trouble drawing the line. He was lonely, yes, in the deep, uncomplicated way that comes from spending most of your time alone. But he was not miserable. He liked the land, even in its stinginess. He liked the particular quality of the sky over the Mimbres foothills at dusk, the way it went through 4 or 5 colors in the space of 20 minutes. He liked his horse, Deuce, who was a sensible animal and a decent enough listener on the subjects that mattered. His nearest neighbor was a retired Army farrier named Gus Tillman, 4 miles east, who kept mostly to himself except for the occasional mule and fence conversation when their paths crossed at the general store. Masilla Wells, the town, was a general store, a saloon, and an assayer who had given up assaying but hadn't yet admitted it, plus whatever else passed through on the stage road. Tom went there every 3 weeks for flour and coffee and the particular quiet of being around people who didn't know him. He had a younger sister in Columbus who wrote twice a year on folded paper. He had not been back to Ohio in 2 years and did not have a specific plan to go. The West replaced the life you came from with the life you were in, and his life was here, doing this, working this land, and waiting for it to decide to cooperate. That changed on a Tuesday. He had gone to the spring early because the trough by the barn had a slow leak, and Deuce needed watering before the heat of the day built up. The spring was a 1/4 mile from the house, down a rocky cut where a seep came out of the hillside and pooled in a natural basin about the size of a wagon wheel. Tom had widened it when he arrived and laid flat stones around the edge to keep the mud back. It ran cool and clear, and he was grateful for it every day. He nearly stepped on her. She was lying on her side at the basin's edge, partially in the water, one arm trailing in the shallows. Her buckskin dress was soaked from the knees down, and her hair had come loose and spread dark along her jaw. She was not moving. Tom stood with the bucket in his hand and, for one stretched-out moment, thought he was looking at a dead woman. Then she breathed, barely, a visible shift in her chest, and he dropped the bucket and went to his knees. She was young, 20, maybe a year either side, skin burning hot to the touch, lips cracked and dry. She had been at the water's edge trying to drink, he understood, and had not been able to manage it. He looked up the cut. He looked down it. He saw nothing except rock and scrub and the long open reach of the foothills going south. He looked at the woman. He picked her up. She weighed less than he expected. Her head settled against his shoulder and stayed there while he carried her up the cut and across the dry grass to the house. He went through his door and laid her on his own bed, because it was the only bed there was. He got the soaked moccasins off her feet and set them by the door. He brought water, lifted her head, made her drink in small measured amounts. He wrung a cloth in cool water and laid it across her forehead. He sat beside the bed and kept watch, through the afternoon and into the night, cooling the cloth when it warmed and replacing it, making sure the water was there when she stirred. He did not sleep. He did not know it yet. He would not know it for 2 more days. But in that single sequence of acts, finding her at the spring, lifting her, carrying her through his door, sheltering her under his roof, he had performed step for step the gestures of an old Chiricahua custom. Among her band, a man who carried a sick or hurt woman across the threshold of his own home had made a pledge. He had committed himself with his body instead of his words, and her people would regard the bond as real from the moment his feet crossed that threshold, with her in his arms. Tom Ashby had no idea this was happening. He was thinking about a sick woman and cool water and the long, difficult night ahead. He kept the lamp low so the light wouldn't hurt her eyes if she woke. Outside the window, the night carried the usual sounds: coyotes in the hills, a night-bird somewhere in the junipers, the soft movement of Deuce in the corral. Tom sat in the chair beside the bed, with his forearms on his knees, and listened to her breathe, and was glad each time he heard the breath come again. The fever broke on the second night. He was on the floor with his back against the wall, drifting toward sleep, when he heard the change in her breathing, slower, deeper, the rattling quality gone out of it. When he looked up, she was watching him. She had dark and very direct eyes, and she used them the way a question is used, taking him apart piece by piece, looking for what kind of man this was and whether she needed to be afraid of him. He said, "You were at the spring. I carried you in. I hope that was all right." He stopped. He had no idea if she understood English. She looked at the ceiling, the window, back at him. She said something in a language he did not have a single word of. He said, "Tom Ashby, that's me." He pointed at himself. "Tom." She watched him for another moment. Then she pointed at herself and said her name slowly enough that he could hear each part of it. He said it again. "Da test," he said. Something shifted in her expression, just slightly, the recognition that he was making an effort. He went and got the water, and she drank without help this time, sitting up carefully, watching him over the rim of the cup, the way you watch a strange dog you have not made a decision about. When she was done, she set the cup on the blanket with a precise and deliberate care that struck him as inherently composed. And she said something else in Chiricahua. He said, "I don't understand." She looked at him. Then she looked at the lamp. Then back at him. She seemed to be making some kind of assessment. He made coffee, because it was the only social gesture he knew to make in his own house, and he offered it to her. She looked at the cup for a moment before she took it. They sat, him on the floor again. He didn't feel right taking up the chair beside the bed she was occupying, and the night outside was full of cricket sound and the far-off yip of a coyote. The lamp threw its small warm pool across the floor between them. He did not know this woman. He did not know her band or her people or where she had come from or where she was going. He knew her name, and he knew the sound her breathing made when it was wrong and when it was right. And he knew she took her coffee without letting go of the handle. Eventually she lay back down. He stayed on the floor with his back against the wall and slept in pieces, waking each time she stirred. And by morning the crisis had passed, and she was simply resting. He was at the stove making cornbread when he heard the horses in the yard. He went to the door and opened it, and they were there. 8 men, their horses ground-tied behind them, standing in the pre-dawn with the still patience of people who have already decided what they came to say, and are waiting only to say it. The nearest man spoke. Tom did not understand a word, but the word came at him twice, and he felt it shape the second time even without knowing the language, the particular cadence of a noun applied to him personally. Husband. Dateste appeared at his shoulder. She spoke to the man in front for nearly 3 minutes without pause or apology, and Tom stood beside her understanding nothing except the tone of it, which was steady and in command. The man in front listened. He glanced at Tom once, carefully, then back at Dateste. There was a brief, conclusive-sounding exchange, and most of the men went back to their horses. One stayed. He was perhaps 50, broad-faced, gray at the temples. He looked at Tom the way you look at a structure when you are trying to assess its load-bearing qualities. He spoke to Dateste. She turned to Tom and said, carefully, "This is my mother's brother. His name is Nantaje. He has come to ask you a question." "All right," Tom said. "He wants to know if you will honor what you have done." Tom looked at her. "What exactly did I do?" she told him. She said it plainly and without apology, and with the seriousness of someone who understood that what they were explaining was not a joke, and did not want it to be received as one. She told him about the custom, what it meant when a man brought a sick woman across his threshold, sheltered her under his roof, tended her through the night. She told him that in the eyes of her band the act was complete. It had been witnessed. It could not be unsaid by pretending it hadn't happened. But there was a formal way to dissolve it if he chose. Her uncle would accept that answer. She would understand it. Tom Ashby stood in the doorway of his one-room homestead in the growing morning light, and thought about this. He said, "I'll need some time to think on it." Nantaje seemed to find this a reasonable answer. He said something to Dateste, mounted up and rode south with the others, and then the yard was empty and it was just Tom and Dateste and the sound of the stove crackling behind them. Dateste said, "I can go with them if you prefer." Tom said, "Is that what you want?" She looked at him steadily. "What I want has not always been the question." He thought about that a long time. She stayed. The first week was its own kind of complicated. Tom gave Dateste the bed and took the floor, and she argued about this briefly using English and hand gestures, and he shook his head and crossed his arms, and she looked at him for a moment and then accepted it. Every morning he made coffee and set a cup outside the canvas curtain she'd rigged to divide the room, and every morning the cup disappeared without ceremony. She was not injured, it turned out, only sick, a fever that had come on hard during a long journey. She recovered fast. By the 4th day she was on her feet, moving through the homestead with the focused attention of a person doing an inventory. And by the 5th, she had reorganized his root cellar in a way that made considerably more sense than what he'd had before, and was looking at the lean-to off the south wall of the house with what he could only read as professional concern. He learned her story in pieces. She was the apprentice of a healer named Nietzsche, one of the older medicine women of her band, and she had been traveling with a small party to gather plant medicines from the high country when the fever came on. Her companions had pushed on ahead to reach the gathering site. They had their own obligations, and the weather had been uncertain, and had intended to send someone back. She had been on her own for 2 full days before Tom found her at the spring. She was not grateful for how that had gone, as far as she was concerned. She knew plants the way Tom knew fence lines, thoroughly, with a practical knowledge built over years of specific attention. She knew which roots in the foothills held water, and which ones sickened you. She knew the difference between 3 plants that looked identical to his untrained eye, and she knew precisely what each one was for, and when you would and wouldn't use it. When the split on Tom's right knuckle, a work crack that had been there for 2 weeks and refused to close, caught her attention, she went out one morning and came back with something she mashed in a clay cup and pressed into the wound with the brisk. Certain efficiency of someone who has done this 100 times. It healed in 3 days. He watched her work. There was a quality in how she moved through the world. Not arrogance, nothing performed, but a settled certainty in her own knowledge and her own judgment that was neither aggressive nor deferential. She made decisions and acted on them. She did not look at him afterward to see if he approved. He found this extremely interesting. He did not say so. He was not a man built for saying that kind of thing out loud. But the way he talked to her changed over those first days, went from cautious and apologetic to simply direct, because she responded better to directness, and he was not at his core a man who found indirectness natural anyway. By the 2nd week she had diagnosed the problem with his corn crop. The south section was not getting adequate water, and what water it did receive was running off the surface instead of reaching the roots, because he had run his furrows at the wrong angle relative to the slope. She showed him with a stick in the dirt. He looked at the drawing, and then at the field, and then at the drawing again. He said, "That's exactly right." She said, "Yes." They rerouted the furrows. She helped, which he had not asked for and which she offered without comment or any apparent expectation of acknowledgment. By the end of the afternoon the work was done, and the field looked like something that might actually produce a reasonable yield come next season. And Tom had the clean, specific feeling of a thing done right. That evening she made something in the cast-iron pot from dried materials she carried in a small pouch, and the smell of it spread through the one-room house like something being undone. He ate 2 bowls of it without speaking. She watched him eat. Whatever was in her expression at that moment was not unkind. He said, "Where did you learn to cook like that?" She said, "From the women, the same place I learned everything." He said, "I've had the same 7 things for 2 years." She said, "I noticed." He laughed. She looked at her own bowl. The silence after that had no weight to it at all. He was not pretending he didn't know what was happening to him. He had enough self-knowledge for that. The house was different than it had been, not louder because she was not a loud person, but fuller in a way that had nothing to do with objects in the room. He woke earlier now. He did not need to. The days had a different texture. Not just the work, though the work was going better, genuinely better in ways that had nothing to do with coincidence, and everything to do with a second pair of eyes that saw things he'd been looking at too long to see. But the ends of the days, the evenings, the particular quality of eating a meal someone else had made, and sitting with the lamp burning low and the coyotes going in the hills and not feeling the usual press of the quiet. He rode into Masilla Wells on the 8th day for flour and oil, and Gus Tillman was at the general store, and Gus looked at him with the level, unsentimental attention of a man who has already drawn his own conclusions. Tom said, before Gus could ask, "She's a healer's apprentice. She was sick at the spring. Her people think we're married." Gus said, "What do you think?" Tom paid for his flour. "I haven't decided." Gus looked at him a long while. Then he said quietly, "The store owner was within hearing distance, and they both knew it. I was in this territory in '71, and I know how some people around here talk about a white man on a small claim who takes in an Apache woman. I'm not telling you what to do, just making sure you know what you're walking into." Tom said, "I know." Gus said, "All right, then." He rode home with the flour and the weight of what Gus had said, and set both of them down in the yard and stood there a minute looking at the homestead. Dodiste was on the south wall of the lean-to, replacing rotted boards she had found in the timber pile. She looked up when he rode in, assessed him, and went back to the boards. No performance of greeting, no checking if she had done something wrong. Just a person doing a job. He put Deuce away and went inside and made coffee and sat at his table and thought. He had $82 when he came. He had failed at everything that had mattered. He was lonely in the clean, dry way of a man who has spent too long alone, the kind of lonely that stops registering after a while because it's simply the air you breathe. And this woman, who had reorganized his root cellar and rerouted his furrows and healed his knuckle and made food that made him eat 2 bowls without talking, had looked at him with those direct, dark eyes and had not asked him for anything. Not sympathy, not a decision she didn't get to participate in. Just the truth of whether he meant to honor what had happened. On the evening of the 14th day, Nantaje came back alone. He rode in from the south just before dusk, ground-tied his horse 50 feet from the house, and sat on a rock and waited. Tom went out. Dodiste came to the doorway but did not come further. Nantaje looked at Tom, and then at Dodiste, and then at Tom again. He asked his question through Dodiste, who translated from the doorway, and the question was the same it had been on the first morning, except that 2 weeks had accumulated, and the question no longer felt like a test. Did Tom intend to honor what he had done? Tom looked at Dodiste standing in the doorway of his house. He looked at what she had changed and built and repaired in 2 weeks, simply by being someone with knowledge and a willingness to use it. He looked at the lean-to wall she had fixed. He looked at the window with the lamp burning in it. He said, "Yes." Nantaje nodded once, slowly, the particular nod of a man who expected that answer and needed to hear it spoken before he could act on it. He said something to Deteste. She translated. He says he will tell the others. He says a man who takes a wife this way takes on a duty to her people, not only to her. He says he will be watching. Tom said, "Tell him I understand that." Nantaje mounted up and rode south, and the dust settled, and then it was quiet. Deteste came out of the doorway and stood beside Tom in the yard. She said, "You did not have to do that." He said, "I know." She was quiet a moment. Then she said, "You should know I could have dissolved this. My uncle would have accepted it. There is a way, and it would not have dishonored either of us." He looked at her. "Do you want to?" She looked at the hills going south, going dark in the fading light. She said, "No." He said, "All right then." They went inside, and she made coffee, and he sat at his table, and the room had the quality of a space where something has been decided that both people knew already, but that needed the words anyway. The weeks that followed were not uncomplicated, but they had an ease underneath the complications that made the complications feel like ordinary life rather than something to survive. Two people sharing a one-room house have to negotiate a great number of small things, and they negotiated them mostly without drama. Who made the fire in the morning, which side of the room held what, how to move around each other in a kitchen that was barely large enough for one. She taught him Chiricahua words, not a curriculum, not a lesson, just the names of things as they became relevant. The word for water, the word for horse, the word for the plants she used on his hands when the work cracked them, the word for rain. He repeated them with the methodical persistence of a man who learns things by repetition and does not stop until he has them. And she corrected him without making him feel foolish, which was its own kind of generosity. He taught her things about the homestead, how to read the pump when the leather washer was going, how to tell from the color of the sky to the southwest what kind of weather was 8 hours out, the particular way the south fence needed checking after heavy rain, because the second post from the corner had been set too shallow and moved if the ground got soft. She absorbed these things the way she absorbed everything, quickly, completely, without performance. One evening, the third week, a clear night, the temperature dropping fast the way September nights drop, he got out the oil lamp and the battered almanac he had bought in Albuquerque his first autumn here, and he showed her the weather diagrams. He pointed at an illustration of a thunderhead and said what he knew of it, and she looked at the page and said the Chiricahua word for that same cloud. He said it back. She nodded. They went through the entire weather section of the almanac that way, trading words over the lamp, and by the end of the hour he had learned 11 words, and she had learned 14, and the table between them held the almanac open, her beadwork where she had set it down, his gloves, 2 coffee cups. He looked at all of it. He felt something settle in his chest, something quiet, nothing he had a name for, nothing that needed one. Outside, the coyotes went through their evening conversation in the hills. The lamp threw its light. Tom Ashby, who had come to New Mexico with $82 and the confidence of a man who hadn't yet needed to be humble, sat at his table with a woman he had not planned on, and thought that the word for what this had become was not one he'd expected to need this soon. There was a day in the 4th week when a fox got into the corn. It had been digging under the south fence, the same post that always moved, and had worked its way into the replanted section and done some real damage before Tom saw the tracks in the morning. He spent 2 hours repairing the fence and setting it right, and when he came back to the house for water, Deteste was already out in the corn pulling the damaged stalks. She had assessed the situation and made a start without him. He stood at the edge of the field and watched her work for a moment. She moved through the rows with an unhurried efficiency, identifying which stalks could be saved and which couldn't, piling the ruined ones neatly. She did not look up when she heard him. He said, "You didn't have to do that." She said, without stopping, "I know." He got his gloves and worked the other half of the row. They didn't talk much. By midday the field was cleaned up and the salvageable stalks had been staked, and they sat on the shaded side of the house with water and ate what was left of the morning bread. She had a habit of sitting very straight and very still when she was resting, the way a person sits when their body does not require fidgeting to be comfortable. Tom had noticed early on that she occupied space differently than he did, economically, precisely, without taking more than she needed. He thought about this sometimes and could not decide if it was training or nature or both. He said, "My mother used to do that with the kitchen garden after something got in. She'd just start." D'Artest looked at him. It was the first time he had mentioned his mother to her. He said, "She died when I was 15. Fever." D'Artest was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My mother died when I was 12. The soldiers came to the camp." He looked at her. She said it without requiring sympathy from him, just offering it plainly, the way you offer a fact that belongs to both of you now. Tom held this carefully. He said, "I'm sorry." She said, "Yes." And then she stood up and took her water cup inside. And that was the end of it. But something in the afternoon was different after that. Some small wall between them that had been standing mostly unnoticed now was not there. There was a night in the 5th week when a coyote pack moved through close to the house, and D'Artest woke before Tom did. He heard her move and opened his eyes and saw her standing at the window in the dark, listening. The pack was singing in the north meadow, not close enough to threaten the corral, but close enough to put Deuce on edge. Tom got up and stood beside her at the window. Neither of them spoke for a while. The coyotes moved south, and the singing faded, and Deuce settled. D'Artest said, "When I was small, I believed each voice in a pack was a different thought." Tom said, "What kind of thoughts?" She said, "Old ones, things that have been in the world longer than people have." She paused. "Ni-Chi told me that." She said, "The coyote sings what it knows and does not edit itself, which is why it sounds the way it does." Tom listened to the last of the sound fading south. He said, "That's a better answer than I've ever had for it." She made a sound that was almost a laugh. He didn't say anything else. They stood at the window until the coyotes were gone, and then they went back to sleep, and in the morning neither of them mentioned it. But it was there between them anyway, added to the count of things that were now shared. The trouble arrived 31 days after he had found D'Artest at the spring. He heard the horse from the well, where he was deepening the casing, a single horse, moving with purpose, that particular sound of a rider who has been traveling and is now arriving somewhere they intended to arrive. He climbed out of the hole and looked south. The rider was already close. He was young, perhaps 25, perhaps a year either side, and he sat his horse with the ease of someone who had ridden before he walked. And he stopped at the edge of Tom's yard and looked at Tom with the expression of a man who has come to settle something that has been unsettled too long. His name was Sgan-do. Tom would not know that for another few minutes, but he knew the shape of what this was before he knew any of the details, because there is a particular quality to the arrival of someone who believes he has a prior claim. D'Artest appeared in the doorway. She looked at Sgan-do, and something in her face went very still, that stillness that is not fear but is its first cousin, the face of someone deciding how much to let show. She spoke to him. He answered. It was short and not warm. She came to Tom and spoke quietly. Sgan-do had approached her family before any of this, before the journey, before the spring. He had offered the bride price for her. Her uncle had not consented, and she herself had not agreed. But Sgan-do had not taken this as final. He had been away raiding in the weeks since, and when he returned and learned that D'Artest was in a homesteader's house, and that the band was treating that homesteader as her husband, he had ridden 3 days to challenge it. By the custom of the band, he had that right. A man who had offered and not been finally refused could demand a test of the man standing in his way. Not combat to the death, not in 1885, not near a homesteader's claim with Fort Bayard, half a day's ride north. Something else, a test of what a man actually was. Tom said, "He will decide that." Tom looked at Sgan-do, who had not moved from his horse and was watching Tom with the flat, calculating attention of someone running an assessment and not yet satisfied with the result. Tom said, "Does he know the whole of it? That I found you sick, that I didn't know what it meant to carry you in." D'Artest said, "Yes." Tom said, "Does it change anything for him?" She said, "He says the custom does not care about intention, only the act." Tom stood in the yard of his homestead on an ordinary autumn morning, with the sun going up and the mountains to the west, and the particular stillness of a moment before something changes, and he thought about this carefully. He said, "Tell him I'm not giving you up." The reply was brief and definite. The test would be at sunrise the next morning. Sgan-do would wait at the spring that night and would not enter Tom's land. At sunrise they would see what Tom Ashby was made of. Tom said he would be there. That night was the longest Tom had spent since the first winter here, when the chimney had blocked and he'd spent 2 days in smoke and cold, wondering if he had made a catastrophic error coming west. Test made dinner. They ate. Neither spoke much for the first part of it. The lamp was low, and the air outside had the clear, cold quality of late September in the foothills, and the house felt like it was holding its breath. She refilled his coffee cup without asking, the way she did, the way she had simply started doing after the second week, and that he had never commented on because it required no comment. He watched her pour it and set the pot back on the stove and returned to her seat. He said, "Does he know you well?" "Sgan-do." She said, "He knows what I looked like. He knows what he wanted when he looked at me." That is not the same thing. Tom thought about this. He said, "No, it isn't." She said, "He came to my uncle 3 times. The first time my uncle said teste is not ready. The second time my uncle said teste is not yet asked. The third time my uncle said he would speak to me. And my uncle did speak to me. And I told my uncle no, and my uncle told him no, but Sgan-do believed that was a negotiation and not a decision." Tom said, "That kind of man is the same everywhere." She looked at him. He said, "Where I come from, too. A man who hears no and decides the door is still open." She said, "Yes." They were quiet again. The lamp put its light on the table between them. Outside, far off, an owl was calling in the junipers. She said, "Eventually, you are not required to do this." He said, "You mentioned something like that before." She said, "I meant it both times." He looked at her across the table. He said, "Why didn't you say yes to him before any of this happened?" She looked at the table for a moment, then back at him. She said, "He is not a man who listens, not to women, not to anyone. He has decided what a thing is before he looks at it, and looking at it afterward does not change what he already decided. I did not want to spend my life being looked at by a man who had already finished seeing me," Tom said. "And you think I'm different?" She said, "You asked me twice if I wanted to go." "Nobody asks that question unless they actually want to hear the answer," he said. "I'll be at the spring at sunrise," she said. "So will I." He started to say that it would be better if she stayed at the house, and she looked at him with the particular steadiness she used when she had already made a decision and was waiting for him to stop, thinking he could change it. And he let the sentence go before it was finished. She said, "I am not the thing being tested, Tom Ashby, but I am not going to wait at a house while 2 men settle what happens to me. I will stand at the spring where all of this started, and Sgan-do will see that I am there because I chose to be, not because any custom put me there, and not because you carried me." He said after a moment, "That's fair." She picked up her cup. He said, "I'll still be there at sunrise." She said, "I know." He spread his blanket on the floor, and she took the bed and the lamp went out, and he lay there in the dark a long time, listening to the sounds of the night and turning things over. He thought about the $82 he had come with, and the 2 thin corn harvests, and the well that needed deepening, and the letter from his sister that smelled like soap. He thought about a woman who had come out of nowhere and put his life in better order than he had managed on his own. He thought about what it meant to be willing to stand at the edge of something you had not chosen, and find in the act of standing there that you had chosen it after all. That somewhere in the 5 weeks of shared coffee and rerouted furrows and trading words over an almanac by lamplight, he had arrived at a place where giving this up was simply not a thing he was going to do. He was at peace with that. He was surprised to be at peace with it, and then he was not surprised, and then he slept. Sunrise in New Mexico in September comes slowly. The dark doesn't end all at once. It dilutes, the east going from black to the deep green-gray that precedes any color, and then gold slipping up behind the mountains in the east and reaching out across the flat and the rock and the dry grass. Tom was at the spring 10 minutes early. Teste walked beside him, not behind him. Sgan-do was already there, sitting with his back against a juniper, and he stood when he heard them come. He looked at that test for a full 3 seconds before he looked at Tom. Nantaje was there too, standing apart in the shadow of another tree, watching with the calm of a man who has attended many such mornings. Sgan-do spoke. Test translated. The test was this. Tom's horse would be taken. Sgan-do would ride due south 1 mile and return. Tom would remain at the spring on his own claim, the only clean water for 3 miles in any direction. And when Sgan-do returned, Tom would let him drink. Tom understood immediately what the test was asking. It was not about the horse, and it was not about the water. It was asking whether Tom Ashby could stand at the thing he owned, at the edge of what was his, and give from it freely to the man who had come to take his wife, without smallness, without condition, without the particular kind of meanness that makes a gift not a gift at all. Whether he was large enough for that. Tom took Deuce's reins and handed them to Sgan-do without a word. Sgan-do looked at the reins in his hand. He looked at Tom for a long, assessing moment. Then he swung up onto Deuce's back and rode south, and Tom walked to the edge of the spring and stood there in the growing morning and waited. It was 53 minutes. The sun cleared the eastern ridgeline, and the shadows went short, and the air warmed by degrees. Tom stood at the spring. Test stood 20 feet away. Nantaje stood in his shade and watched all of it. Tom did not pace. He stood the way a person stands when they have decided to stand and have nothing more to decide. He thought about his sister's letters, and about the failing corn, and about a woman who had reorganized his root cellar. And he stood and waited. Sgan-do came back on Deuce at a walk. The horse was not lathered, he had been ridden, not punished. Sgan-do dismounted and brought Deuce to the basin and let him drink. And Tom stood at the edge of the water and did not speak. When Deuce had his fill, Sgan-do straightened up. He looked at Tom, not the assessing look from the beginning, something different now. A man who has measured a thing and found it has some weight. He spoke to Nantaje. Nantaje answered. A short exchange. Then Nantaje spoke to Teste. She said, "He says a man who stands at what is his and gives water to the man who came to take from him, that is not nothing. He says the bond holds." Sgan-do mounted his own horse. He looked at Teste once more. She met his eyes and held them and said something brief and clear in Chiricahua. Tom didn't ask what it was. He didn't need to know. Sgan-do rode south. He didn't look back. Nantaje came to Tom and put one hand on his shoulder, one hand briefly, the kind of contact between men who are not given to saying things directly. He said something. Test translated. He says you should come to the camp before the cold weather. The healer has something for you, something for the well. Tom said, "Tell him we'll come." Nantaje mounted up and followed the direction Sgan-do had gone, and the dust they raised hung in the still morning air and then settled. And then it was just the two of them standing at the spring in the growing light. Test looked at the water for a moment, then at him. He said, "What did you say to him at the end there?" She was quiet a moment. Then she said, "I told him that I had been carried across the threshold by a man who did not know what he was doing, and that by the time I did know, I had already decided he was worth staying for." Tom looked at the spring. He looked at the hills going south where the horses had gone, the dust already settling back to nothing. He looked at the woman standing beside him who had taught him 11 Chiricahua words and shown him his furrows were wrong, and fixed his lean-to wall and healed his knuckle in 3 days, and stood at this spring this morning not as a prize but as a person with a position she had staked out herself. He said, "I didn't know what I was doing when I picked you up." She said, "I know." He said, "I know what I'm doing now." She looked at him in the plain, direct way she had, the morning light coming over her shoulder. She said, "I know that too." He took her hand where it hung at her side. She let him. They stood there at the spring where all of it had started, and neither of them was in a hurry to go anywhere. They went to the camp before the first frost, riding together on Deuce and a horse Nantaje sent for Teste, 2 miles through the foothill scrub on a clear October morning. The healer Nietzsche was a small, very old woman who looked at Tom when he arrived and then said something to Teste that made Teste cover her mouth for a moment. He asked what she had said. Teste said, "She says you have an honest face, but your hands are wrong for farming, and someone should have corrected that before you came all the way out here." Tom said, "She is not wrong." Nietzsche looked at him a long moment. She said something else. Test translated, "She says she has been a healer for 40 years, and she can see what is real and what is pretend. She says this is real." The healer went into her dwelling and came back with a bundle of plant roots wrapped in cloth, for the well, as Nantaje had said, something to improve the taste of the water. She pressed it into Tom's hands without ceremony, and held his gaze for a moment, and then turned away, which he understood to be the end of the audience and did not take personally. They stayed through the afternoon. Test moved through the camp with the ease of someone returning to a place she knew, greeting people, speaking quickly, laughing once at something an older woman said. Tom sat with Nantaje by a fire, and they shared it without much talking, because their shared vocabulary was still small. But the fire was enough, and the companionship of two men who have come to understand each other through an event, rather than through words, was its own kind of sufficiency. When they rode home in the late afternoon, the light was the color New Mexico light gets in October, amber and very low and absolutely clear. The shadows stretched long behind them. Test rode slightly ahead and to his right. He said, "Does it bother you that it started the way it did? That it was an accident?" She thought about it the way she thought about everything she intended to answer honestly, fully, without hurrying. She said, "The custom does not care about accident. It cares about the act. You found me, and you carried me in, and you stayed. Many men would have called for help and walked away and told themselves that was enough." He said, "That thought didn't occur to me." She said, "I know that is exactly the point." They rode the rest of the way in the settling quiet of the afternoon, and the house appeared ahead of them, with the lamp Test had left burning in the window, the way she always did when they both went out, so there would be a light to come home to. He had never thought to do that before she was here. He understood the point of it now. That winter the well held in the root cellar was full, and the house had a new room off the south wall, which they had built together over several weeks of autumn work, choosing stone from the hillside, setting it with mortar, Teste holding the plumb line while Tom set the courses. The room was bigger than it needed to be and had a window facing east, because she had asked for it so the morning light would come in first thing. He did not argue about the window. Nantaje came through twice in the cold months, and spent evenings at the house both times, his English improving across the season enough for direct conversations on the things that needed saying. He always brought something. Dried meat once, a worked leather tool collar, news of the band and the territory and things that mattered. He looked at Tom differently than he had in September. The watchfulness was still there. It probably always would be. But underneath it now was something that felt, in the way of men who do not use the word, like respect. Tom's sister wrote in the spring. He wrote back more than he usually did. More than he ever had, actually. He didn't explain everything, because there was more to explain than a letter can hold. He said the land was doing better, and that he had help now, and that things had changed. His sister was a perceptive woman. Her reply came 6 weeks later and said, "I'm glad you found someone to be alongside. That's the only kind of company worth having." He thought about that and found that he agreed with it completely. There is an old understanding among the Chiricahua, a custom that goes back before anyone can say when it began, that a man who carries a woman over his threshold and shelters her under his roof has made a choice with his body that is as binding as any choice made with words. Tom Ashby did not know this the morning he found Test at the spring. He was not thinking about customs or choices or the binding weight of gestures. He was thinking about a sick woman lying in cold water, and the plain, obvious thing a decent person does about that. But what began as an act of simple human decency became something else, by degrees, by the rerouted furrows, and the healed knuckle and the 11 words learned over an almanac in the lamplight, by a morning at a spring with a rival on horseback, and a woman standing 20 feet away who had come not to be stood over, but to bear witness to her own life, by a winter that passed warm in a house that had been too quiet too long, and a new room with a window that caught the morning first. By the time Tom Ashby understood what he had done when he carried a woman across his threshold, he had already made that same choice 100 times over, in smaller acts that needed no custom to sanction them. That is the thing about doing the plain, decent, obvious thing without calculating the consequences. Sometimes the life that results from it is the best one you were ever going to live, and you get to be surprised by that later, At a spring in October, with the light going amber and a woman riding slightly ahead of you, who has reorganized the root cellar of your life in ways you are still finding and being grateful for. Tom Ashby came to New Mexico in 1884 with $82 and a confidence he had not earned yet. By the autumn of 1886, he had a working claim, a deeper well, a corrected field, a new room on his house, 11 words of Chiricahua he used correctly, and a wife who could heal a cracked knuckle, read the sky, and reorganize a root cellar with a thoroughness that still, after a full year, had the power to humble him. He was glad of every bit of it. If this story meant something to you, please give it a like and pass it along to someone who needs a good story, and subscribe if you want to keep up with what comes next. We tell these slowly, the way they deserve to be told, without shortcuts, without hurry, and with the whole truth of them intact. See you next time.